Hi everybody, my name is Sean Doherty. I'm a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School where I work on a variety of different healthcare initiatives in chronic care. But the reason I'm here today is that I was the founder of a venture philanthropy fund called the T1D Fund. T1D stands for type 1 diabetes, about 10 years ago. And we have a great group of panelists here that covers the spectrum of a really vexing problem that a lot of the prior panels have talked about over the course of the morning and afternoon, and that is, how do we deal with the intractable issue of bridging really high quality research into companies that can turn them into investable drugs, and then obviously on through the process through pharma. A lot of you have touched on it because it's really difficult. And my experience on it was actually coming in from the outside. My son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at just 2 years old. There's been a lot of talk about diabetes today. Most of that's been about type 2. Type 1's an autoimmune disease, and my son was suddenly diagnosed 2 weeks after a well visit at 2 years old. It happens that quickly. It meant that he no longer makes any insulin at all, and they're essentially on life support through insulin pumps for the rest of their lives. He's doing great. He's 25 years old now. But about 10 years ago, I got really interested in why it was that we were talking about great research for decades, literally decades, and there is terrific research in type 1 diabetes and other autoimmune diseases. Why are we talking about all this research, and yet there was virtually no life sciences venture capital investing in curing the disease? How could those two things be true? And what came out of that, through a lot of work, I worked at a big investment firm at the time, and with a lot of collaboration within there and some other parents, we came up with an idea to catalyze a market in type 1 diabetes using a venture philanthropy model that we call the T1D Fund. Skip ahead to today, that market's catalyzed. There's been more than $1 billion of venture capital, private venture capital, invested in cure therapeutics and type 1 diabetes, and probably about another $4 billion or so in acquisition capital and in public market capital. So it worked in this sort of situation. But it's unclear how it'll work across all different diseases because there are a lot of particularities for ours. So today the focus what I really would like to focus on is the bridge. We've touched on it in other panels, but how do we deal specifically with that problem from getting from research to development? And I know a lot of you represent different sources of capital, some philanthropic, some non-philanthropic, and some both. I think there's extraordinary opportunity kind of across the spectrum because all of the different parts of the puzzle need to interact. Philanthropy, while amazing, can't do everything. Actually, only about 2% of all the capital that's gone into develop drugs over the last 20 years comes from philanthropy. Double that comes from governments, and all of the rest of it is the private sector. And so the real question, I think, for all of us who care about these issues is how do we catalyze private capital to get in. So what I'd like to do is kind of divide this up into 5 different sort of pastures, and we'll see how it goes. We have a lot of people on the panel, so we'll be a little bit flexible about how we do it. I'm going to ask each of the panelists, you just heard who they are and you have written introductions, but when you answer the question the first time, just sort of introduce yourself for a couple sentences so we can get into the meat of it. So here's the 5 things that I'd like to do. Why are we talking about this? What is the constraint that is making it difficult to translate great research funded largely by the government and philanthropy into financially backed drug development? Second, okay, so what exactly are we talking about? From this stage, you'll hear different ideas from the T1D Fund. One of them actually will also include the T1D Fund and Stephen, but how do we, what are different methods of constructing it, and why were those methods constructed in that way? Because every disease is different, money's different, all sorts of things are different. Third, how does it work? How does it work? How do you work on this interface between this bridging mechanism, the research funders, and the largely venture-backed biotech companies? Fourth, how do you know if you're winning? And fifth, where do we go from there? So that's a lot to cover. But you know, I'd like to just because there's a lot of great talent on this stage, just so we'll jump around a little bit and make it conversational. I think I'm gonna ask Luke to start off, because he has really deep experience on both sides of the spectrum in philanthropy and and really terrific venture capital experience that you can read about. What's the whole? What's the problem we're trying to solve in the first place, Luke?
Thanks, John. Well, just 2 seconds on my background. I was a co-founder of NPM Capital. First of all, I spent now over 30 years in the venture capital industry. As I said, co-founder of NPM Capital, biotech-focused venture capital firm. We started that back in 1997. We've raised over the years 15 different funds and many billions of dollars. I've stepped back in the last couple of years to be a senior advisor and to focus on the other activity that I've spent now many decades on, and that is the chairman of the Scleroderma Research Foundation. I'm also the co-director of the research program there. So I took over as chairman back in 2002 from a very charismatic founder of the foundation, unfortunately passed away due to complications to her scleroderma. But anyway, I've been very involved and have led the research activities as well as many of the other activities at the Scleroderma Research Foundation. So, talking about a little bit what we do at the Scleroderma Research Foundation and sort of thinking about what we've done at NPM Capital, I think it sort of illustrates a little bit the divide, and I'll talk about it for just a minute or two. Like a lot of disease-focused foundations, Scleroderma Research Foundation is focused on making grants largely to academic institutions, and we're focused largely on mechanistic research, trying to uncover basically some of the drivers, the pathway drivers in the disease, with the expectation that if we can make the links clear enough that someone else, venture, pharma, it's not really defined, will come in behind us and will then basically write the large checks that it takes to basically catalyze that mechanistic research into actual therapeutics. Of course, there isn't really any specific sort of linkage onto how that therapy is going to get developed. There's just an expectation that there's an engine behind it, which is, I think, frankly, true with most disease foundations. Now, flipping over to the NPM Capital side, and the opportunity that we saw, this goes now back obviously many decades, is we specifically built that venture capital firm to do a fair bit of company creation. We saw the opportunity that there was this mechanistic research, largely funded by the government, but also by philanthropy and foundations. But there was a huge chasm, if you will, a valley of death in between those discoveries and actual fleshing out the commercial opportunities. And we saw that as the venture capital role. I will say, I think that early stage model has been really stressed over the last couple of years, and we can talk a little bit about how well that's actually working and whether, how sustainable that model is as we go forward.
Thanks. And Patricia, you've through your foundation have done, funded a lot of great research, but now you're looking about branching out in other directions to include investing. Is there a frustration behind that? But what are you seeing as the frustrations in doing solely research that makes you want to expand out of that?
Yeah, I think the research doctors will hate that I say that, but it's as a single philanthropist first, and then as a founder of a nonprofit that supports diabetes cure prevention and research and now diagnostics and investments. We initially started supporting academic research, and as you see how limited they are in the philanthropic arm, some of these foundations, they just receive grants, they host events, they engage communities and private donors to support their funding, but they depend on the other 40% of government funding. They need to match public funding with private funding. And over the years, you'll see the trend of some of these institutions, the research institutions can get over 15 or 20 million a year, which doesn't move the needle on what they need to actually solve the problem on curing diabetes. Because when you look at the financial boundaries of the FDA, you will not be able to go over the barriers of 250 million that they would actually cost. to get that drug in the market. So it's kind of a frustrating moment of awareness when you realize that, and on top of it, you realize that a year ago this funding was cut by the government, so even more challenging. But I always call it fun challenges and fun opportunities to look at. So that's why we launched our impact fund in diabetes health technology, because that's one of the segues where we can still create an impact in the diabetic community, offer solutions in the innovation side.
Thanks. And Matt, your perspective is a little bit different from everybody else on the panel, because you're entirely regular way venture, and I know focus in Israel. When you and I were speaking earlier, you had some interesting observations about, what is it that you wish you were able to get from disease philanthropies and research foundations, because I think that'll help to inform the next part of this conversation as we think about solutions.
So, thanks. Great being here. Thank you, Patricia. So I invest in companies in Israel that are in the bio-AI space. We talked a lot about that in prior panels. Our thesis is that this is a global phenomenon, but Israel, by virtue of its ecosystem, is really at the forefront. And what I see in Israel is a lot of, I would say, kind of entrepreneurial scientists and private investigators that have a mindset of wanting to bring things out of the clinic and into the real world. And many academic institutions, health systems have accelerators and vehicles for trying to help that. But there is a gap, and the gap is often around, specific things. So like one thing specifically, I like companies, I love AI, but AI is only useful if it's got a data set that's interesting on which it can operate. Well, a lot of these academic efforts and these early companies need money to build the data set. Israel happens to be very, very good at that, but it could really accelerate it and make it more attractive for investors, including the philanthropies themselves, to help these early efforts build the clinical data sets that can lead to great therapies, great diagnostics, etc. So that's kind of number one, I think, is getting, and if I could put in a commercial for Israel, because I think it's overlooked in the philanthropic world. I would say that if you're running a big foundation focusing on any disease, take a trip to Israel, make your way around the health systems, find out what the scientists and the doctors are doing, and you will find things that you will want to find. I guarantee it.
Go ahead.
I just want to sort of tag on to that. I think what you can hear from everyone on this stage is belief and passion around a particular subject matter. And I know Luke had it at NPM because I got to see it, and I know Stephen had it with T1D, and of course everyone else on the panel shares it. But I think that is often what is missing in our system, is true core belief, willing to wait it out, willing to do what it takes to either cure a disease or treat a condition. And I think that's what we all represent on this stage, is that, yes, we're all doing it slightly differently to each other or have our own versions of a model, but we're taking a thesis and we're running it to ground. And that's what I see up here.
So as someone that's talked about this in various forms over the last 10 years around the T1D fund, one of the things I get criticized for a lot is it seems like there's an implication by me that I'm criticizing research foundations. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I just think that we have this very, very complicated matrix that the mosaic actually, that sort of has to work all together in order for us to deliver drugs to patients. And each one of them has a different role, and those roles overlap. I think a big challenge of it is a lot of people really just don't understand how things get from basic science all the way through venture capital-backed biotechs into pharma and through the FDA and to patients. It's a long process involving really basically success by virtually everyone involved in any given thing. And so this is more about how do you fill in gaps. So now we know that there's a gap. There's people specialized in doing basic science. There's people, a very different group of people, specializing in taking developed science and turning it into drugs or drug candidates ready for clinical trials. But what are some ideas about how what those ideas are, what are those ideas and how can they work. I'm going to start with you, Stephen, and in full disclosure, Stephen and I worked together at the T1D Fund when he started we were about, I guess, 4 years into doing it at the time. It was, to me, the first real validation that we were creating a market in type 1 diabetes, because otherwise, how could we possibly have attracted a very senior life sciences venture capitalist to come and lead our efforts, and that was all part of the market making exercise. So maybe talk a little bit about how the T1D Fund works for the uninitiated, and you know, I'll ask the same of you, Meg, about how yours works.
Yeah, so thanks, Sean. So Stephen St. Peter, I'm a Midwesterner who started my career here in New York City, combining finance and medicine. I worked for the Carlyle Group, then Apex Partners, and was an assistant clinical professor at Columbia University when my life changed because I got a call from the folks at NPM in Boston. That includes Luke and his co-founder, Ansberg Gattaca. So I'm sort of bookended. I don't know if you've been in this situation in your careers where you're bookended by two people who've been very influential in your life and in your career. But I joined NPM to really bring new therapies forward for patients and had the opportunity to do that as a partner with NPM for about a decade. I think Luke underemphasized the importance that was the first biotech-focused fund, having invested in now hundreds of companies with more than 50 therapies approved by the FDA and companies that NPM has worked on. And I was lucky enough to ultimately leave my investing role to found and lead a company as a CEO, take it public, one of the 50 companies that NPM has taken public over the last couple of decades. That was a very successful sort of life-changing outcome for me, and I didn't know what I was going to do with my life at that point. Worked with NPM on a company in Munich to chair an immuno-oncology company. When I met the other person who called me, Sean Doherty, who had this vision that he already outlined, and I thought, wow, that is really cool. And I had missed the role that foundations could play and what they could bring to the table. And so I joined Sean's vision to implement the idea of how could we access the network and capabilities that these large foundations have built up over decades by funding researchers who, by the way, are also running clinical trials. And how could we bring them into the mix? And as the part of that, how could we bring the families into the mix, which was something very new from a venture capitalist. It's sort of an anonymous pension foundation endowment fundraising gig. But Sean had raised ultimately $100 million from 100 families who shared the mission of they were going to give money to the foundation to participate in that area between research and commercialization, to fund the biotech companies that were translating all of that science into therapies. And so, Sean, you recruited me to implement that vision. We did it with, passion. We ultimately invested in 46 companies working in, they always had to have a type 1 diabetes program, but they could be more focused more broadly in other indications, which I think was a strength, but we wanted to help them with their T1D program. And so the mission was to put in equity alongside the investors and help the company succeed, whatever that meant. I mean, whatever resources we could bring to bear, we would take a seat at the table. We were a fraction of the money that was raised. Our goal was to invest as little money as possible and find other VCs like NPM to come in and provide the majority of the capital, but we were aligned with them. And all of that money went back into the fund, and that was the model that we took off on. So I just think that was an incredible model that opened my eyes to the idea of doing it with a professional team. We set up a separate team in Boston that I led and recruited. The foundation's based in New York. We had an incredible relationship with them, but we had a different job. And so that's just the scale that Sean set up to let's just go do this. And so we did it. It was an amazing 5 years.
So the T1D Fund, to be clear, because I want to contrast it to what Meg is working on, the T1D Fund is explicitly, at least under my leadership, was specifically designed to be catalytic. In other words, we knew we weren't going to be the big source of the capital. I come to this from a very basic perspective, and I like to say, just like there is a very thin line between love and hate, there's a very thin line in investor sentiment between a group of professionals looking at a space and saying, well, that's too risky, I don't want any part of it, and, oh my gosh, how have we not invested in this yet? In a nutshell, that's all I ever wanted to accomplish with the T1D fund, was to just move investor sentiment from here, that's too risky, from here, we gotta jump in because there's a ton of white space and opportunity. And it was meant to be catalytic. So, in fact, at the beginning, we only wanted to invest about $1 for every $5 that private investors invested, and we got to more like 1 to 8. Now, Meg, yours is not.
I don't think that it's too I don't think it's too dissimilar. I mean, where we invest is in blood and cell-based technologies, and I don't want to get into the specifics, but basically if it touches blood, involves blood, has a cell in it, we can invest in it. Therapeutics, devices, diagnostics. Now this has been an ignored area within the VC ecosystem. It's not to say that they hadn't historically invested here and there hasn't been precedent, but it's about re-energizing the MPMs of the world to reconsider coming back into the space. Technology's advanced, and that yes, there are graveyards here, there, and everywhere, but it's we're trying to recreate that opportunity around often ignored or misunderstood therapeutic paradigms. So it's not too dissimilar.
And Patricia, say a little bit about what your vision is of your investing vehicle out of the foundation. I know you're just getting started in it, but how do you think of it working? How it's going to work with other parts of the system?
So our mandate is very fixed on health technology innovation, kind of early stage, but it's really hard to define early stage between Europe and America, as you know, there are different names for it at different stages, but really finding the partners to co-invest, diabetes funds specifically to co-invest with the best performing companies in the fund. So as we launch, we can be successful either on the revenue side and putting those companies on the market as fast as possible.
And so now let's move into the third kind of pasture of this, which is how does this actually work? These all sound like great ideas. Yes, the researchers and biotechs maybe operate in a little bit of a different field. They have different sort of mindsets, perhaps different training. Okay, now we have these few great ideas that we're talking about how to bridge the gap. But now, how does it actually work? And as importantly, not work? Luke, you've spent your career on kind of both sides of this. What do you think makes for a successful and productive relationship between research foundations and I'll just say research capital more generally and the private sector? What works, and in what circumstances does it just not work, whether it's behavioral or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, the role that we always thought was the rare skill set that we tried to bring when I was at NPM Capital was there's a lot of basically barriers to basically getting a company stood up, getting the licenses established with the academic institutions, fleshing out the intellectual property position, which oftentimes gets started with the academic filings, but tends to basically fall short of where you would really want it to be from the commercial perspective. And basically trying to get all those pieces put in place, and we thought that was a rare skill set that we could basically bring to the party with professional venture capital. But a lot of times there was a misunderstanding of what we thought was the value prop on our side with what I think the foundations and frankly academic institutions thought the value that they were providing. So there was a bit of I think we thought a misunderstanding just because of how much capital, how much expertise we thought we were bringing on the NPM side with sort of how far you really had to go with an academic quote-unquote breakthrough. The distance from that to sort of real value is pretty substantial. And I think, as we all know, having lived it now for a while, the chances of success are unfortunately not so high. So you have to take a couple of different shots, and you sort of have to have a broad enough perspective and a broad enough portfolio of activities, even within one company, much less across the portfolio, to ultimately win. And I think there's a little bit of, obviously, if it's your baby, your discovery, there's I think a necessary sort of tunnel vision about how valuable that is, but that tends to lead to some misunderstandings about working productively together. And so I think there's still room to sort of smooth that out and make that substantially more efficient.
Well, just maybe to follow up on that a little bit, because I know a lot of people in the room fund research scientists in one way or another, directly or indirectly, as part of even a diligence process. Say something about the types of activities, behaviors, personalities that research scientists that are successful in working with commercial actors. What do they bring to the table? And actually, Matt, I'd ask you the same thing as well, because you've seen you've just seen it from your perspective.
It's a really interesting question. So I was involved, and still am involved, in an angel group that invests in companies with roots in Israel's research institutions, including the Technion. People started off philanthropically, funding the different labs, and the scientists that are most effective to me that are getting funded are, I don't know any other way to say this, but they're the most charming, articulate, charismatic. That it's not all scientists, believe it or not, can hold a conversation about something outside of their area of expertise. So the ones that are really good at getting their labs funded are the really well-rounded scientists. And if you have someone that's well-rounded and also brilliant in their field, then that's sort of a home run. And I think that they tend, at least in my observation, which is not as broad as some of the other folks, they tend to attract a disproportionate amount of the philanthropy and the grants.
Are you saying that's a good thing or a bad thing? I was more asking about from a biotech executive's perspective or venture capitalist perspective, what are you looking for in behaviors? And Luke, I want to make sure you get.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because when I talk to some of these scientists directly and I'm trying to find out what they're doing and is there anything investable right now, usually there isn't. But the things that I wound up pursuing were things that were out of their lab already for 2 or 3 years, right? So it's had, it's formed a company, it's had, people talk about the valley of death. It's also sometimes just a flat plane that's flat for a long time before it hits an inflection point. And sometimes these things just need to season as companies outside of the academic environment for a while, and it takes a long time. So, I'm looking for things that have de-risked the science in some way or another, whether that's happened in the lab, but often it's happened outside of the lab. And going back to kind of point number 1, the philanthropic dollars that would be useful, I think, for investors is when they can participate in this de-risking of the science to the extent possible. That makes it, because investors, I don't know what it was like for you, but tend to be more comfortable, at least I am, with kind of commercial risk rather than sort of like the basic science. So you're always going to take, as we talked before, about taking some science risk, but that would be a useful thing for the research capital.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
If you want to add on to that,
No, I think that's well said. But to pick up your point, Sean, I think the scientists that I think are the most effective in helping getting companies launched are those that appreciate the gaps in what's really, even in their own work. Because you do want someone who wants to be a proselytizer and a salesman for your stuff, and obviously being charismatic helps tremendously. But you really need somebody who also understands where the holes are. They're the expert in the field, and you do need somebody who can bring that perspective and help basically address the problems, before they, in some ways, kind of before they occur. You need somebody to look around the corner. If you have to basically hit every single pothole yourself, it's going to be a long, long road. And there are brilliant scientists who I think are able to look around the corner, and to some extent, the intuition of building the right companies is figuring out that you are working with a scientist who kind of has that kind of sort of perspective and has that kind of capability.
And Meg or Stephen, maybe just based on that, what those two just described, how do you think these sort of bridging models help to mitigate that? Well, at least I hope they are, but.
Well, I hope they are too,
How do you
but
think that
I might
works?
not be the person to answer that question. But, I think what we have to remember too is that investors are investing in a business with a scientific strategy, right? And there aren't many who can manage a company, be in the C-suite of the company from start to end. And by end, I mean commercialization. That's a very rare breed. And so I think always, sort of self-analyzing and then asking yourself, how long will I be involved in this? And I think the most successful sort of place for us, this type of investor, is to coach them towards the decision making and really prepare the company, the business itself, to onboard traditional capital. I do a lot of coaching, mentoring, guiding with my CEOs, and it doesn't always work, but I think it's additive. At least it's additive to the ecosystem. It may not be incredibly impactful for that particular company, but I feel like I'm doing my part.
Yeah, so I'll make a different set of comments, not to minimize at all what's been said, because I think getting companies ready to be funded is a really important and valuable thing that some of the not-for-profits and philanthropies can do, both universities as well as some of the research foundations. But the other thing that's really important to remember is that some of these disease philanthropies have tremendous network and access to doctors and clinicians. And when it comes time to run a clinical study, they are the experts. They are one phone call away from the experts. And so if you're a company that has a platform and you're moving into the clinic and you're trying to choose your indication, that is another brilliant spot where you can access these disease philanthropies to help them figure out what patients, how are we going to enroll them, what are we going to look for, what does the FDA want to see. How can I, if I'm going forward in lupus, how can I construct a type 1 program to be a second indication to validate my platform? So I would say it's not just the get ready for funding, but it's how do you interact with the well-funded companies that are looking to do multiple expansions that are raising $50 to $100 million, and how do you get your network of physicians and into that conversation? How do you get a seat at the table so you can make sure that those companies avoid the mistakes that you've seen 5 other companies make? I mean, that's where you really make progress, is sometimes it's just not doing the stupid thing, but doing the thing that might actually work and anticipates what the FDA may want to see.
All right, so now let's push on to how these things are actually working. Are they successful, and how do we know? I think that one of the things that all of us, as philanthropists and people interested in making people's lives better, in curing disease, have to be very aware of holding all of the deployers of capital to account. Whether it's a regular research philanthropy, whether it's a venture capital fund where your success is going to be more, in some ways, more easily measured on financial return, to these bridging mechanisms in between where, candidly, I think it's very difficult to try to say, how do you know that you're being successful? You can't measure it in research grants, you can't measure it in as easily in financial returns as you can with the venture firms. Meg, you all are relatively early in your
Yes.
journey here.
Yes, we are, and we're measuring based on, graduation. So have they graduated to the next round? But I really want you to answer the question, because I think there's a Harvard business case just about this that you are part of. So how did T1D address impact measurement?
Well, it's interesting that you asked me, because that was my next question to Stephen. You've memorized them better, probably. I'll tell you what I cared about first, though. What I cared about, because you're going to have a more complicated answer. Mine was very, very simplistic, because I'm not a medical doctor or a life sciences investor. What I knew is that I am a very, very big believer in the extraordinarily smart people occupying the life sciences venture capital space and the biotech space. It's one of the great strengths of this country. It's one of the great strengths of this country whose leadership is currently at risk because of everything that is happening right now. And what my mission was with the T1D Fund was just, how many of these folks have decided that it's really interesting, financially, biologically, systemically, to cure type 1 diabetes. And one of the reasons I left the T1D fund 2 years ago was I don't really have anything else to add. There is a catalyzed market, and now I believe if the business case and the scientific case is there to cure this disease, one of these amazingly smart people who focuses on this 24 hours a day is going to figure it out. And so my measure was how much money we were attracting. They used to drive Stephen crazy, but you had other measures too.
Yeah, so what we did not measure was financial returns, which drove me crazy because we actually, the $100 million we invested, we returned all of that back to the foundation by the time we left. And so the financial returns were actually really, really awesome as a function of the great entrepreneurs and companies that we backed. But what we did track were 6 metrics, 3 financial, 3 non-financial, meaning mission metrics, FDA approvals, drugs and clinical studies, and the number of companies that we'd invested on the mission metrics side. And I'll let you go to that case study. It's fascinating to read about how we incentivized and aligned that team to do what we wanted them to do.
I'm going to allow a little bit of time for questioning. I think we're finished at 4:30, so we have a little bit of time left. But before we do that, I want to spend a little bit of time on one final thing, and it's a little bit of a kind of a multi-part question, and that is, where do we go from here, given all the variables that are involved right now? We have significant declines in research funding in the U.S. That's coming at the same time of, life science is always cyclical. This one's a tough one. This is a particularly rough one, and we have these sort of models that are developing. I'm going to start with you, Patricia. And it's like, when you see everything that's happening around you right now, what does that make you and the people on your team want to focus on the most? And then I know there's a few other ideas on the panel about good ideas going forward that meet the moment.
No, I think it's very important to look at other markets so far that are suffering from high rates of pandemic too. It might not be only necessarily the US market, but other markets in India, Asia, the Middle East. And there's great cross-pollination collaborations with other big companies, like technology companies and so on, that are opening division healthcare investments, and they're really eager to deploy capital. So finding those great partners with aligned mission and the honesty and the goals that can align teams efficiently, I think it's one of the things we need to be looking at, and also internally, nationally, or even between America and Europe. There's a lot of collaboration to be made between those investments in diabetes, health technology, therapeutics, medtech. Our mission, our team, is focusing on creating those collaborations to improve technology and science. That's the main goal. The goal is to put those treatments, devices, and technology out in the market so we can improve people's lives as fast as possible, because there are great sources of funding, and knowing that one source of funding is out of our plan, we need to move fast. We need to have different mindsets, collaborative teams, and really finding these solutions. It is happening right now.
Thanks. And maybe Stephen or Luke, either one of you, whichever prefers. They're coming up with a new idea that's yet another nuance on the spectrum in between pure philanthropy and pure venture on the other hand.
Yeah, so I'll talk about that. But first I'll say, Patricia, I love what you guys are doing, and Sean, some of the work that you've done since leaving the T1D fund. I sleep better at night knowing that people are paying attention to those problems, because what I do is drug development. So I'm going to go work on drugs, but it's really reassuring to know that other people are paying to other applying skill sets in other areas. So my insight is that this bridge between venture and philanthropy, I think, is really important and is a new model. So Luke and I have co-founded a firm called 𝐵 Ventures, and what we're trying to do is we're partnered with 11 different autoimmune diseases to work systematically on a cross-autoimmune basis to bring the power of these disease-focused philanthropies into a more systematic way. Because the companies that we would like to invest in, they are working in multiple indications, and the pharma companies want them to be working in multiple indications. One of the challenges is that the disease philanthropies were created and are very focused on single diseases. But these diseases are all linked. There's more than 100 autoimmune diseases, and they affect 8 to 10% of the population, and they tend to occur in families. And so what is it at the system level that's going on that can inform us of how to cure these diseases, sort of like oncology was 15 years ago? Now we know there's master pathways that are important in controlling a number of different cancers. And autoimmune disease is the second largest category in human medicine. So this idea of trying to systematically approach that is what we're doing. And the other element to what we're doing, Sean, thanks to you, is bringing to the table families as the investors. And there are families that have the resources, as we know from the T1D fund, that are willing to put money behind a credible team and a strategy to make that happen. So we're embedding a, let's say, $50 million venture philanthropy where we're asking the families who come in to make an investment, but commit to all of that money going into a donor-advised fund to do philanthropy that they think is important. But on the way to that, you know, we're going to help fund therapeutics, and then we'll find, hopefully, the majority of the capital from regular for-profit investors who will come in. And again, they're investing for multiples, which works for the disease philanthropy, you know, venture philanthropy model, because we're trying to multiply the amount of philanthropic capital. So we're trying to sort of embed a true venture philanthropy within a larger impact opportunity and trying to invest across autoimmune disease at the clinical stage. And so that's sort of what I'm doing next.
The thing that I think that they've overcome so far that I was actually quite skeptical about when I first heard the idea is that it's very difficult sometimes, and Patricia, you and I talked about it a little earlier too, it's difficult sometimes for different disease philanthropies to work together. And there are a lot of reasons for that. There's cultures within each one of them. Fundraising is a constant chore. And unfortunately, that leads to competitive behavior and something that probably should be more collaborative. And the fact that Luke and Stephen have been able to bring together, how many are we up to now? You said 12? 11 different disease philanthropies focused on adjacent diseases. You know, for all the talk we had of type 1 and type 2 diabetes earlier, for the most part, the main thing that type 1 and type 2 have in common is the complications that come from having high blood sugar for a long period of time. Type 1 diabetes has more in common with MS and lupus, as a matter of fact, than it does with type 2 diabetes, and so they're tapping into that, to that kind of idea. Before I turn it over, I hope we can get a few questions from the floor. Anything that any of the five of you have been dying to say that I've cut you off inadvertently?
Well, we just need more of us. This stage should be a lot bigger, right? As far as the next step is concerned.
And there are a few out there. There are a few.
There are.
The Autism Impact Fund is a really interesting one. SCI, which is in spinal cord, is a really interesting one. Multiple Myeloma Fund is great. There are some that are more on the for-profit side, but do the same thing. Dementia Discovery Fund. It's a really, really interesting field. And my encouragement to you is to resist labels and resist a lot of slogans on it. Really, if you're interested in things like this, really look into what exactly they're trying to accomplish. And I hope maybe think about this conversation. There's pure research, there's pure investing, and it seems to me one of the hardest parts is that thing in between. And we haven't entirely figured out how to do it yet. And I think it's exciting that people care about it, but I think it's important to be realistic. Any other things? And I hope maybe we can get, maybe we have maybe time for a couple questions. Sure, over in front.
Yeah, I'm Irving Weinberg. I run a venture studio in Maryland. I run a venture studio in Maryland. I don't know if that's all. And what's interesting is just listening to you guys, I looked it up. So islet cells, they're really actually neuromodulation targets. That's what we do. We do neuromodulation. It's very successful. You can treat somebody with 4 weeks and they're going to be good for the next year. So I'm going to be talking to you guys. It's thank you.
All right, I'll ask a question. Speaking of venture studios, do you have any thoughts on, and Stephen, I'm not sure if this is kind of the model that you described, but that philanthropic venture studio model tied to a fund, kind of like, I don't know if you're familiar with Blackbird Ventures, Blackbird Labs in Maryland, where they have a nonprofit venture studio. They're tied to geography, where it translates the research, speeds up the commercialization, and then you bookend that with a venture arm to co-invest and take it to market. So is that kind of what you're doing, or if not, do you have any comments on that type of model?
Just a quick comment. I don't think we should be throwing rocks at anyone. I think that different models are fantastic, and as long as they're held accountable to track and report the metrics that validate their existence, I think all models are great, and I don't have the solution. We're doing something different, but those other models, are also legitimate and valid, is all I'd say.
Yeah, I've had people come to me just saying, they would just like to basically copy the T1D fund and do that again. And the first thing I say to them is, you actually don't want to do that. What is it specifically that you're trying to accomplish? Describe to me the state of funding, the state of research, and the state of commercial investment, and how many disease-modifying therapies are in your space. In our case, we had none. No disease-modifying therapies. And an 80% research market share between the major research organization and the Healthy Charitable Trust here in town. And that was the basis of the idea. That's not true in most other diseases, and so you do something modestly different. Same principle, but probably a different structure, a different approach, different team.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of approaches to sort of trying to bridge the academic gap, and I do think there's, sharing a common infrastructure helps a lot, because infrastructure is expensive and gets in the way of getting stuff done. So I think all those labs where there's a common infrastructure that's sort of prepaid, and you can basically dock, an idea straight in and just pay effectively the variable cost helps tremendously. To pick up where Matt left off, I think there is usually a fair bit of risk reduction that's required between a great academic paper that hits a podium and when it's really investable. A couple of years of seasoning and some additional basically work in those incubator tech models, I think is super helpful, I think can absolutely be catalytic, and particularly if they take the sort of the fixed cost out of the mix, it can be more remunerative. It's tough if you have to pay for the whole thing.
Okay, I think this might be our last one.
I'll be quick. I just wanted to make sure I understood the model. So essentially, you're going to be doing a DAC for mechanism-based research, and then after you've actually proven out the science, you could then invite normal 2 and 20 VC funds to come in and invest in the technology that comes out of it and make that more sort of clinically relevant. I think it's a wonderful idea. I just want to really make sure I understand.
Well, so the model that Stephen and I were working on is really we have sort of two different ideas there. I think Stephen talked a little bit about the funding model in terms of where the money comes from, building community there. In terms of stage, we think the opportunity and where we think it's going to be most impactful for the people who are going to come in and fund this is actually more like the Series B and Series C stages, and I think Stephen talked a little bit about this, but just to sort of